have a very significant component of their wine industry is now the export of technical services. All the work they did in the science and engineering approach to wine, that much more systematic experimental approach to wine, has paid off. Simply put, the Australians are now teaching the French how to make wine. Ultimately, the wine industry in Australia brings together, of course, a tremendous natural resource, but one that for 100 years was not exploited by the entrepreneurs, companies, or public-private collaboration within the Australian environment. Instead, it was only with the development of a healthy rivalry based on quality, execution, and innovation, an increasingly sophisticated local market, local demand, and the development of complementary services, joint marketing agreements, public and private collaboration that allowed the Australian wine industry to go from a footnote to perhaps the most important new player on the wine scene over the last 30 years. Ultimately, how do we take together, how do we bring together these ideas about how clusters matter and how do they matter for economic performance? Along with my long-term co-author, Mike Porter, at the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at Harvard, as well as a number of collaborators at the MIT Entrepreneurship Center and a wide variety of groups funded by a number of grants from the Department of Commerce, we've been engaged over the last several years in the Harvard-MIT Cluster Mapping Project. What the Cluster Mapping Project does is try to understand and provide systematic evidence about the impact, about the choices, about the influence of clusters on various facets, various elements of economic performance. Ultimately, how the Cluster Mapping Project works is that there is a group of about 46 clusters that are sort of all defined according to various industrial codes. Once again, these are not the traditional bringing together of industries bringing of industries into broad industry codes. Instead, these are bringing industries together based on patterns of input-output linkages and co-location of employment within the U.S. economy. So, for example, the automotive cluster brings together a wide variety of industries that cross many traditional industry codes. With those industry codes, with those cluster definitions in place, we've been able to break down, for example, the U.S. economy into the clusters that make up the traded sector, the natural resource-based sectors, and the local sectors. Not surprisingly, most economies, including Korea, including the United States, most of its domestic economic activity is in fact focused on local sectors. But of course, the growth of the economy, the global impact of the economy is going to be driven by its traded sectors. What we're then able to do is look within those traded clusters and understand how different regions are different, understand the comparative advantage, the underlying cluster-based competitiveness of different regions, for example, in the U.S. economies. For example, I think that, for example, Minneapolis, Minnesota is a tremendous leader in surgical instruments and medical equipment. Places like Newark, New Jersey, the big pharmaceutical cluster there, and places, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, around Boston, Massachusetts, that combine an education and research sector with an incredible expertise at biotechnology and related areas. We're able to then to take this data and understand it in a number of ways and kind of look at, for example, here's a state of the U.S. economy, Wisconsin, and looking at, for example, how do the clusters map into employment and growth in employment. But much more interesting for this particular meeting is we're able to then take those cluster definitions and look at them across countries. So, for example, here we look at the Korean National Cluster Export Portfolio, looked at over the past decade. As you can see, and not surprisingly, Korea has tremendous strength in areas such as marine equipment, communications, automobiles, and information technology. Though interestingly, interestingly, over the past decade, nascent leadership in some areas has been reinforced. For example, the role of communications in the global economy has clearly increased. Korea has had tremendous growth in that cluster. In others, most notably information technology, the very high rate of growth within Korea has still been at a lower rate than the growth of that cluster on a global basis. And so there are areas where Korea is not only at a leadership level, but also improving. And then there are areas where Korea has been at a leadership level, but is sort of treading water, sort of staying in place relative to its global position. We then take that data, and I'm going to talk here just a little bit about the evidence how we've used that evidence in the US. Essentially what we've done is to try to really dig down into the impact of clusters on economic performance. Essentially what we're able to do is to look at essentially how does an industry do, an industry that's in a given location within a given cluster. So each industry is part of a cluster, and obviously it's within a given location. And then what we're able to show is that industries with stronger clusters were associated over the past 20 years with much higher levels of job growth from the early 1990s through the mid to late 2000s. We've done that basic idea across a wide variety of performance measures, and essentially what we've been able to document on a systematic basis is that a strong cluster environment is the seed corn, is the ingredient in new business formation, in the growth of new industries, in job growth, and even in the survivability of those new businesses. Ultimately, cluster strength is a driver of regional job growth, wages, patenting, entrepreneurship, and survivability of startups. What we see is that those effects are reinforced when we see specialization in strong clusters, when the clusters have increased breadth, and when the cluster environment is not only a given cluster, but that each cluster, that your leading clusters are themselves complementary to one another. Okay. So with that as kind of background, what I then want to do is then move on to then think about the special role played by innovation and entrepreneurship in understanding cluster dynamics. Clusters are particularly powerful drivers of economic performance when they leverage regional innovative capacity and regional entrepreneurial capacity. These three factors together form the triangle for regional economic performance. For example, I'm going to talk a little bit about my hometown, about MIT and Boston for a second. MIT's life sciences cluster is an incredibly powerful engine for growth, not simply in the biotechnology industry, but also is complemented by a tremendous set of academic medical centers, by expertise and depth in medical devices, and also by a range of research institutions, both colleges as well as specialized research institutes that are the seed corn for the ideas that are then commercialized by biotech, pharma, medical device, so on and so forth. Right? Ultimately, MIT serves as the fulcrum for the Cambridge, Massachusetts biosciences cluster. This is a picture of, if you look at the piece in the purple, that's MIT, and all the little red dots are biotech startups. We have several hundred biotechnology startups literally within walking distance of campus. My co-author, Mike Porter, would also note that this picture excludes off and up to the left Harvard University, which is, there you go. Okay. Moreover, MIT itself has sort of levered that entrepreneurial ecosystem by allowing and facilitating the development of true commercialization efforts off of the underlying ideas being developed on campus. MIT produces, on average, about 150 patents per year within the US, just as a single university. And just to give you one example of this, the kind of handsome-looking guy up to the top left there is Bob Langer, one of our leading scientists at the convergence of materials science and bioengineering. Bob has produced more than 1,100 scientific articles and granted more than 760, and been granted more than 760 patents, and been involved in the development of, I believe, at this point, more than 60 startup companies. He is essentially by himself a startup nation, right? Another example, just to kind of round this out as we think about the role of this kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem at the university-industry divide in an emerging cluster such as clean energy. This is Dr. Yetming Chang, an MIT material scientist. He wrote a little paper that had this as its main equation. That equation, now I know we have some more engineering-oriented people in the audience, and they might be able to tell me what that equation means, but I know essentially what its impact is. That's the light bulb. But what's the real impact? The impact is that that equation tells you how to deliver a tremendous boost to the power that you can derive from traditional lithium-ion batteries. That impact allowed him not simply to write that up for some academic journal, but to found a company. If you look at the equation, the left-hand side of the equation is A123, and that's what Dr. Chang named his startup, A123 Systems, that has become one of the most important drivers of the revolution that we're seeing in electric batteries in the United States and more globally. So with that as kind of background, so the first part of this is to understand the kind of notion of an innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem grounded in the ability of an economy to have regional innovation capacity and regional entrepreneurship capacity. Regional innovation capacity is the capacity of a region to generate new-to-the-world ideas, products, and services supported by people. You have to have an R&D workforce. That's an area that obviously Korea does very well in. Availability of risk capital, as Saul mentioned earlier. Infrastructure, both physical and virtual, information technology infrastructure, as well as good logistics. Having a favorable policy environment, for example, the ability of innovators and entrepreneurs to protect their ideas, to have effective antitrust policy, effective immigration policy, to provide significant rewards for innovators, so that the ability of an individual who comes up with that good idea and does have that drive and effort that Saul talked about is not simply able to to make a demonstration, but is able to earn a significant commercial and financial return. And then finally, a demand environment that rewards on the basis of innovation rather than simply on cost. As I mentioned before, Korea has established itself as a global innovator. It has a high rate of international patenting. These are patents taken out in the US as well as in other countries. But note that that's not simply a matter of the fact that Samsung likes to take out patents. But instead, Korea employs innovators, scientists and engineers at a high rate relative to other OECD economies, particularly once you account for the fact that Korea has a lower overall level of economic development and GDP per capita than the average of the OECD. In a series of projects, we've then gone about and assessed national innovative capacity by essentially kind of getting at the kind of root causes of what drives innovation at the national and regional level. We've been doing that work for quite a long time now, and I was the last time that I was in Korea, had the opportunity to present this in this kind of work in 2003 at the International Conference on Growth Engines in Korea conference in Seoul. And what really comes out of that work is trying to understand the underlying elements of innovative capacity for the economy. We've been able, along with some collaborators, these collaborators in Australia, Joshua Gans and Richard Hayes, they've done a great work updating our Innovative Capacity Index. You probably can't see the Korean data there, so I've brought it out.